I thought loyalty was unconditional until my wedding day proved otherwise. My parents refused to attend, ashamed that I chose Mark, a man they saw as beneath me. Their silence felt like exile, their words sharper than steel. Enjoy your mistake. What they didn't know was the truth waiting to surface, a truth that would turn their judgment into regret they could never take back. I'm Emily Carter, 28 years old. And tonight I'm sitting alone in my small apartment, staring at an old wooden chest that has followed me since. My parents never really looked at these. To them, these little victories were just noise. In their eyes, I was always a puzzle they couldn't quite solve, while my younger brother Daniel was the perfect melody they loved to hum along to. That thought takes me back in time. I was 17, standing in the kitchen, clutching a letter of acceptance from the university I had dreamed about since middle school. It wasn't just an acceptance, it was a partial scholarship to study art history. My heart pounded with excitement as I told my parents, waiting for them to smile, to hug me, to say they were proud. But my father's face tightened. He set the letter down as though it were nothing more than junk mail. "Emily, we've already discussed this," he said flatly. "You'll study business administration. That's the path that leads back to the company." She just stood there, arms crossed, as though my dream was some childish phase I'd eventually abandon. I tried to reason with them, explaining how art had always been my passion, how this scholarship was rare, how I wanted to carve my own future. But my father's response was final. A stone wall I couldn't move. "Then, take care of yourself. If you won't follow the plan, don't expect us to carry you. Prove your value on your own." Therefore in his bide. It is a for in a dated. Those words branded me. At 17, I had just finished editing another manuscript. The kind of quiet work that fills me with purpose but never impresses anyone in my family. I was rinsing a coffee cup in the sink when suddenly, with no warning, the pipe beneath burst open. Water gushed across the floor, soaking my socks in seconds. I panicked, fumbling with towels and an old bucket. But nothing slowed it down. My small kitchen quickly turned into a shallow pool, heart racing. I pulled out my phone and searched for an emergency plumber. The dispatcher promised someone would arrive within the hour. When the knock finally came, I opened the door to a man in a simple navy work shirt, tool bag slung over his shoulder. He looked to be in his early 30s, broad-shouldered but approachable, his hands steady as he greeted me with a calm smile. "Evening. I'm Mark Turner. You called about a burst pipe?" There was nothing flashy about him, nothing rehearsed. He stepped inside, crouched by the sink, and immediately got to work. The way he handled the tools, swift, precise, almost instinctive, was oddly reassuring. I found myself watching more closely than I should have, drawn in by his focus. Within minutes, the water was under control, the chaos shrinking to damp towels and a few puddles. He explained what had gone wrong, his tone patient, never condescending. I expected the usual detached professionalism, but instead he spoke with a quiet pride. "I've been doing this for years," he said, tightening the final bolt. "Some people think fixing pipes is just grunt work, but every system has its quirks. Like a puzzle, I like figuring them out, making them run smoother than before." And Kane in the complay, it was it not of raid. I was surprised by the conviction in his voice. He wasn't embarrassed by his work, he respected it, maybe even loved it. As he packed up his tools, I realized how rare it felt to meet someone so straightforward. No pretenses, no hidden agendas, just a man who showed up, solved a problem, and left a piece of himself in the honesty of his craft. When he handed me the invoice, I caught myself lingering on his name, Mark Turner. It was the first time in a long while that a stranger had left me with more than just a repaired kitchen. He left me with a small, unexpected shift inside, a reminder that respect and dignity aren't defined by titles or family approval. The night after the pipe burst still plays in my memory like it happened yesterday. One moment I was rinsing a cup, And the next, I was standing ankle-deep in cold water, staring at my kitchen floor as it turned into a shallow lake. I scrambled, grabbing every towel I owned, throwing them down, pressing with my feet. Anything to slow the spreading mess. Nothing worked. My apartment, already small and worn, felt like it was collapsing around me. By the time I found the number for an emergency repair service, I was close to tears. I spoke too quickly, tripping over my words as I described the flood. And the woman on the other end promised someone would come as soon as possible. All I could do was wait, pacing back and forth, wringing out my hands like the towels I kept tossing in the sink. When the knock came at the door, I opened it with relief and a bit of embarrassment. Standing there was a man with dark hair pushed back under a plain navy cap, his shirt embroidered with a small logo I didn't recognize. He carried a heavy tool bag like it was nothing, and greeted me with a voice that was steady, reassuring, almost warm. "Evening. I'm Mark Turner. You're the one with the stubborn pipe?" I stepped aside, letting him in. There was no hesitation in the way he moved. No wasted words. He crouched down, pulled open the cabinet under the sink. And within seconds, his hands were busy, confident, practiced, as though he'd done this 1,000 times. Tools clinked against metal. His flashlight beam danced across the wet floor. And little by little, the chaos shrank. I found myself watching more closely than I intended, noting the calm expression on his face. He didn't seem irritated by the mess or by my nervous questions. Instead, he explained what he was doing, breaking it down into simple terms, never once talking down to me. "This valve's old," he said, tightening it carefully. "Probably hasn't been looked at in years. Happens a lot. Nothing to panic over. You caught it quick. And ID." His words eased something in me. For the first time that night, I felt like I wasn't failing. Like this disaster wasn't entirely my fault. Within half an hour, the water was under control. My kitchen looked like a war zone of damp towels and puddles. But the pipe was secure. He stood, wiped his hands, and smiled in a way that wasn't forced. "Should be good for now. I'll need to come back later in the week to replace a section. But the emergency's handled. Just to be masked." In thanks is though, there was no arrogance in his tone. No need to make himself seem bigger than the job. He was simply proud of the work he did. That struck me. My parents would never see value in something like this. But here was a man who didn't flinch when others might dismiss him. As I signed the invoice, I glanced at his name again. Mark Turner. It was strange after all the years of people telling me I should chase status and wealth. The person who calmed me in a crisis was a man who carried himself with quiet dignity, proud of his craft. I didn't know it yet. But that night, in the middle of a flooded kitchen, something in my story had shifted. Mark came back a few days later, just as he'd said he would. By then, the towels were washed, the floor scrubbed, and the panic had faded into one more memory of life's little messes. But when I opened the door and saw him standing there with the same tool bag slung over his shoulder, I felt something I hadn't expected, a flicker of comfort, like the return of someone familiar. He crouched down again under the sink, working with that same calm precision. I made tea in the kitchen, and for the first time, we talked beyond the job itself. He asked me what I did for a living, and when I told him I was an editor at a small publishing house, he didn't dismiss it or joke about how little money that must bring in. He just nodded and said, "That sounds like important work. Someone has to make sure the words make sense." It was no from the starting. It was such a simple statement, but it landed with me. My own parents never described my work as important. To them, it was a hobby I'd foolishly turned into a career. Yet here was this man, kneeling on the tile, treating my answer with respect. Over the next few weeks, Mark returned a couple more times to check on the plumbing and replace worn parts. Each visit stretched a little longer. Not because the repairs were complicated, but because our conversations flowed easily. We talked about books, about the quirks of old buildings, about how he'd gotten into his line of work. At one point, as he tightened a joint, he said, "You know, I think of every water system like a puzzle. Each pipe, each valve, it all connects. My job is to figure out how to make it flow without friction. When it does, it feels like harmony." In statement, Jalan way informant, and a state packend of never, the way he said it caught me off guard. It wasn't just plumbing to him, it was art. It was philosophy. And in his words, I heard something that resonated with me. I spend hours combing through sentences, searching for rhythm and clarity, trying to make messy thoughts flow into meaning. We weren't so different after all. I started to notice things I hadn't at first, the way his eyes lit up when he explained something, the way he listened with full attention, as though every word I spoke mattered. Those small details began to soften something in me, a part that had been hardened by years of dismissal and quiet loneliness. There were moments, small but undeniable. The quick smile we shared when I handed him a glass of water after a long afternoon of work. The easy laughter when I admitted I'd tried to fix a leaky faucet once and made it worse. The quiet pause as he packed up his tools. Neither of us rushing to end the conversation. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of romance you see in movies with sweeping gestures and instant sparks. It was something slower, gentler, like the gradual warming of sunlight after a cold morning. And as I closed the door behind him one evening, I realized I was standing there, smiling to myself. For the first time in a long while, I felt the stirrings of hope. Not the kind of hope tied to my parents' expectations or society's checklists of success, but the kind that grows when you sense someone truly sees you. I didn't know where it would lead. I only knew that with each visit, each exchange, the silence in my life felt a little less heavy. For weeks, Mark and I settled into a rhythm of small encounters and quiet moments, each one building on the last. He wasn't just the man who had fixed my pipes anymore. He had become a presence in my life, steady, genuine, and strangely reassuring. But as our connection deepened, so did the voice in the back of my mind. My parents. The thought of introducing Mark to them sat like a stone in my stomach. My family had always measured people by their resumes, their income brackets, the circles they moved in. To them, success had a uniform, tailored suits, polished shoes, degrees framed on office walls. Mark didn't fit that picture. He worked with his hands, came home with grease on his shirt, and didn't seem to care what anyone thought of it. And yet, that was exactly what drew me to him. I wrestled with it quietly, running through imagined scenarios in my head. Would my parents dismiss him the way they had dismissed my choices? Or could they see, as I did, the integrity and intelligence behind his work? Some nights I would lie awake replaying their likely comments, already hearing the sharp edge in my father's voice, the subtle disapproval in my mother's sigh. Still, a part of me held on to hope. Maybe if they met him, truly met him, they would understand. So I made a decision. I would bring Mark to dinner at my parents' house. It felt bold, almost rebellious, but also necessary. I didn't want to live with secrets or pretend relationships. If Mark was going to be a part of my life, then he deserved to be seen, not hidden. The night I invited him, I expected hesitation. Instead, he just gave me that calm, unshaken look of his and said, "If it matters to you, it matters to me." Those words steadied me more than he realized. Preparing for that dinner was like preparing for a storm. I cleaned the apartment more than usual, as though somehow that would make me feel more in control. I picked out a dress that struck a balance between elegant and understated, not wanting to give my parents any reason to critique. In the kitchen, I fussed over a casserole recipe my mother loved, trying to convince myself that familiarity might soften her mood. But beneath all the busy work, my nerves thrummed like live wires. I felt caught between two worlds, the one I had been raised in, defined by appearances and expectations, and the one I was beginning to choose for myself, built on authenticity and quiet strength. The night before, I caught myself staring at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. My own eyes looked uncertain. As if searching for permission, I whispered out loud, "This is the right thing." Saying it didn't erase the fear, but it gave me enough courage to take the next step. When the evening arrived, I set the table with more care than I had in years. Plates, napkins, wine glasses, it all looked perfect. But my hands still trembled as I placed the silverware. Mark noticed. He touched my shoulder gently and said, "Whatever happens, I'll be myself. That's all I can be. And besters and if too tapid." And with that, the stage was set. My parents would walk through the door any minute. And for the first time, the man who had quietly changed the rhythm of my life would meet the people who had shaped it. I didn't know if the night would end in understanding or disappointment. But I knew one thing: there was no turning back. When my parents finally arrived, I felt that familiar knot tighten in my stomach. My mother stepped inside first, her eyes darting around the apartment with that silent inspection she'd perfected years ago. My father followed, his presence filling the room like an unspoken authority. They both smiled politely when they saw Mark, but I could sense the undercurrent even before a word was spoken. The first few minutes were almost pleasant. Small talk about traffic, the weather, the new restaurant my parents had tried. Mark was gracious, easy with his words, never forcing himself into the conversation, but never shrinking away either. I thought, for a brief moment, that maybe this evening could turn out better than I feared. But then, as the main course was served, my father turned his attention directly to Mark. "So," he said, his fork poised in midair, "what is it you do for a living?" I froze, holding my breath. Mark answered without hesitation. "I work in plumbing and water systems, maintenance, repairs. And I also design more efficient systems for buildings and gardens. It's something I care about, helping people's homes run the way they should." We weren't insisted. The silence that followed was deafening. My father's eyebrow arched so high it practically disappeared into his hairline. My mother pressed her lips together, as though tasting something sour. And then, with that sharp tone I knew all too well, my father repeated the word as if it were foreign to him. "Plumbing. So, unclogging drains, fixing leaky faucets?" Mark didn't flinch. He didn't apologize, didn't fumble. I didn't try to sugarcoat his words. He simply nodded. "Yes, and also designing water-saving systems. I take pride in it. Any job done with care has value. It is a pace." I felt my cheeks burn. Though not from shame of him, never from him. It was the reaction of my parents. Their open disapproval. That stung. I could feel their judgment hovering over the table, weighing down every bite. My mother cleared her throat, trying to redirect. But her discomfort was written all over her face. "Emily," she said, turning to me, "I thought you'd eventually bring home, well, someone different. Someone more." She didn't finish the sentence, but I knew exactly where it was going. Mark calmly lifted his glass, took a sip of water, and set it down. His composure in the face of their disdain made my chest ache with both pride and sorrow. He wasn't defensive. He wasn't angry. He was just steady, as if their opinions couldn't shake the foundation he stood on. The rest of the meal dragged on in strained silence. Every clink of silverware felt like thunder. I tried to spark conversation, asked about my father's work, to my mother's garden, but each attempt fell flat. They couldn't see him the way I did. They refused to look past the surface, past the job title, past the grease under his fingernails. By the time dessert came, the tension was unbearable. My parents excused themselves early, with smiles that were tight and insincere. My father shook Mark's hand with a grip that was more test than greeting, and my mother offered a polite but distant goodbye. When the door finally closed behind them, I exhaled a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. My heart was heavy. Yet, at the same time, I felt an odd sense of clarity. Mark looked at me, his eyes soft but unwavering, as if to ask if I was okay. And in that moment, I realized something important. I wasn't ashamed of him. Not one bit. If anything, I was ashamed of the people who couldn't see his worth. After that dinner, there was no pretending anymore. The polite smiles, the small talk, the illusion that my parents might come around, it all dissolved the moment the door closed behind them. I sat in silence with Mark for a long time that night, replaying every word, every look exchanged across the table. He didn't push me to talk, didn't press for answers. He simply reached for my hand, grounding me the way he always did. Over the following weeks, the distance between me and my parents grew wider. Phone calls turned into brief, clipped conversations. Invitations home grew scarce. When we did talk, the subject of Mark hovered like a storm cloud we couldn't avoid. My mother's voice would tighten as she asked, "Are you really serious about this?" My father, more blunt, once told me, "You're throwing away everything we've given you." Interesting that meaning. Also for Gray. But the truth was, Mark wasn't taking anything from me, he was giving me something. Peace. Steadiness. A love that didn't demand I prove my worth. After years of chasing my parents' approval, of bending myself into the shape they thought I should be, I finally felt like I could just be myself. So when Mark looked at me one quiet evening and said, "I don't need anything fancy, but I do want to spend my life with you," my answer came without hesitation. "Yes," I whispered. And then, louder. "Yes. This me." We started planning something small, intimate, just a handful of friends. A simple ceremony. Nothing extravagant. It was the opposite of what my parents would have envisioned for me. And maybe that's why it felt so right. When I finally told them, it went about as badly as I feared. My father didn't even try to hide his anger. "If you go through with this, Emily, don't expect us to be there. Don't expect us to stand by and watch you throw your life away. And it can right things state." My mother's words cut even deeper. "You're forcing us to choose between our daughter and our standards. If you love us, you'll reconsider. And it can right things state." I sat there, listening to them set the ultimatum, feeling my heart pound like it was about to break through my chest. Part of me still wanted to beg, to plead for them to see what I saw in Mark. But another part, the stronger part, finally rose to the surface. With tears in my eyes but steel in my voice, I said, "If your love for me depends on who I marry, then maybe it was never really love to begin with." Think speeded exer as of says thatnest. The silence that followed was heavier than anything I'd ever felt. My parents looked at me as though I'd just slammed a door in their faces. But for once, I didn't crumble under their gaze. I stood tall, my voice didn't shake. When I left that night, I knew there was no going back. It hurt, God. It hurt more than I can describe. But walking out with Mark's hand in mine, I also felt something else. Freedom. Courage. A strange, fierce relief. For the first time in my life, I chose myself. And I chose him. Our wedding day didn't look anything like the grand celebrations my parents once imagined for me. There was no cathedral, no orchestra, no ballroom filled with acquaintances in glittering gowns. Instead, we chose a small garden just outside the city, tucked behind an old inn with ivy climbing its brick walls. A few rows of white wooden chairs lined the lawn, and a string of fairy lights swayed gently overhead in the spring breeze. It was simple, unpretentious, and deeply ours. The morning had been filled with nervous laughter and the soft chaos of friends rushing around with flowers, ribbons, and cameras. My best friend Anna pinned a stray curl behind my ear and whispered, "You're glowing." Really glowing. I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror and, for once, I believed her. But when I stepped onto the grass and began walking down the aisle, my heart sank just a little. At the very front, in the row reserved for family, sat two empty chairs. They looked so stark, so painfully obvious among the others filled with smiling faces. I had braced myself for that sight. I told myself again and again that it wouldn't matter. But the ache was real. Still. As soon as my eyes found Mark standing at the altar, everything else blurred away. He looked at me like I was the only person in the world. His calm steadiness shining through even as he blinked back tears. That gaze, that love, carried me forward until I was standing right in front of him. The ceremony was short, heartfelt. Our friend Daniel, ordained just for the occasion, spoke about love not as a fairy tale but as a choice to stand together through storms, to keep showing up even when the world doesn't understand. His words sank deep, because that was exactly what we had lived. When it came time for our vows, I could barely hold the paper still in my shaking hands. "Mark," I began, my voice wavering. "You taught me that love isn't about perfection, or status, or pleasing anyone else. It's about showing up, every single day, with kindness and patience. You're my steady place, my truest friend, and the love of my life. I promise to stand by you. Always." "It is a card, Stenik." He smiled, took my hands, and in his quiet, certain way, said, "Emily, you've given me a home I never thought I'd find. With you, I can be completely myself. I promise to honor you, to laugh with you, to hold you when it hurts, and to love you in all the years ahead. Today." Then came the rings. As I slid the simple band onto his finger, I felt a wave of emotion that caught me off guard: joy, grief, hope, and relief all tangled together. The world seemed to narrow to just that moment. His hands in mine, our eyes locked. "By the power vested in me," Daniel's voice rang out, and the applause that followed was warm and genuine, filled with the cheers of people who truly loved us. Yes, the empty chairs were still there, silent reminders of what I had lost. But when Mark kissed me and the crowd erupted, I realized those seats didn't define this day. What defined it was the strength it took to stand here, the courage to choose each other, despite the cost, and the happiness radiating from every person who had shown up to support us. Walking back down that aisle as husband and wife, I felt the ache still lingering in my chest, yet over it, louder and stronger, was a conviction I had never known before. We might not have had my parents' blessing, but we had love, real, undeniable love. And in that moment, it was more than enough. 2 months slipped by in the blur of newlywed life. We settled into our small apartment with mismatched furniture, laughter echoing in the evenings, and long walks where the world felt wide open. I thought the drama with my parents had finally gone quiet. We weren't speaking much, but there was no more yelling, no more ultimatums, just silence. Then, one Saturday morning, everything shifted. I was making coffee when Mark walked in, holding a glossy magazine in his hands. "You're not going to believe this," he said, setting it on the table in front of me. The headline on the cover nearly knocked the breath out of my lungs: "Mark Turner and the Future of Water, a Green Breakthrough." Inexplicably, inside was a 6-page feature with photographs of him standing in front of sleek machinery, diagrams of filtration systems, and quotes about sustainability and innovation. The article revealed what Mark had only ever shared with me in bits and pieces: that he had studied environmental engineering at Stanford, that he had co-founded a startup called Aquacore, and that their new technology for water reuse had just secured $2 million in venture funding. I stared at the words, my heart pounding, because suddenly the man I loved wasn't just the thoughtful, kind partner I knew at home. He was someone the business world was calling a visionary. That same week, my parents got hold of the article too. I found out when my mother left a voicemail on my phone. Her voice was shaky, almost unrecognizable. "Emily," she said, We read about Mark. Why didn't you tell us? We didn't know." Then she hung up before I could call back. Later, a mutual friend told me my father had shown the magazine to one of his colleagues, trying to mask his shock with pride. though everyone could see through it, apparently. He had been quiet the whole evening after reading the article, pacing around the house, muttering about how he might have misjudged everything. For me, it was surreal. Part of me wanted to shout, "I told you he was special. I told you he was brilliant and hardworking and worthy of love." But another part of me felt strangely numb, because hadn't I already known all along? Did it really take a glossy spread in a magazine to convince them? Mark, of course, remained humble. "It's just one article," he said with a shrug, kissing my forehead. "It doesn't change who I am." And he was right. Success didn't make him different, but it sure made my parents reconsider their story about him. The next week, I got an email from my father. Just a single line, "We'd like to talk." That was all. No apology. No explanation. Just an opening. I sat staring at the screen, torn between anger and a small flicker of hope, because here was the truth. I was proud of Mark long before the world noticed him. I had chosen him, not because of Stanford, not because of funding rounds, but because of the way he looked at me when I doubted myself, the way he listened when no one else would, the way he loved without condition. Still, I couldn't deny that seeing his name in print stirred something deeper in me too. Pride. Yes. But also relief, as if finally, there was evidence outside of myself to validate what I had always known. Evidence that maybe, just maybe, would soften the walls my parents had built. At night, lying beside him, I whispered, "They'll come around. You'll see." He squeezed my hand, not needing the article, not needing their approval. And yet, somewhere inside me, I began to wonder if this twist of fate was the very thing that might open the door to healing what had been broken for so long. It took another 2 weeks before my parents reached out again. This time, it wasn't a vague email or a hesitant voicemail. It was an invitation. My mother called in the late afternoon, her voice careful, almost rehearsed. "Emily," she said, "your father and I would like you and Mark to come over for dinner. Just a simple meal. Nothing formal." Hey, the words caught me off guard. For months, our conversations had been sharp edges or empty silence. To hear her extend an olive branch, well, it made me both hopeful and wary. I could tell Mark felt the same when I told him later that night. He smiled softly, though there was a flicker of concern in his eyes. "If you want to go, we'll go," he said, "but only if you're ready. Thanks for watching. It's Romualda Fanes to the way at it was no per." Walking up the steps to my parents' house that evening felt like stepping into a memory I wasn't sure I wanted to revisit. The same front porch where I had once stormed out in tears, the same doorway where my father had stood, arms crossed. When he told me Mark wasn't enough, my stomach tightened as I rang the bell. Inside, the house smelled faintly of roast chicken and fresh bread. My mother greeted us at the door, her hands twisting nervously in front of her. My father appeared from the kitchen, his posture stiff but not hostile. For the first time in months, there was no anger in his face, only something that looked like uncertainty. We sat around the dining table, the four of us, and for a long moment nobody spoke. The clinking of silverware and the faint ticking of the old wall clock filled the silence. Finally, my father cleared his throat. He looked straight at me, then at Mark, and said, "I suppose I should have listened more closely. If I had known, if you had told us sooner about Mark's work, about his future." I didn't let him finish. My chest tightened, and the words came out steadier than I expected. "Dad, I did tell you. I told you he was intelligent, hardworking, kind. I told you he was building something, even if it didn't look like much at the time. But you weren't listening. You only heard what he didn't have: money, status, a name you could boast about." And bristed. The air grew heavy. My mother lowered her eyes to her plate. Mark reached under the table and squeezed my hand. My father leaned back in his chair, his jaw tense, as though weighing my words. For the first time, he didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply nodded. Slowly. Like a man realizing he had missed something important. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was the closest we had come in a very long time to speaking the truth out loud.